All right, I was intending on working on another project today, but combination of things. One, I'm sitting in the middle of another really dark, cold, wet Washington winter day. Yes, winter is not over for me yet. And I was up most of the night last night, for whatever reason, stewing on a particularly controversial topic in our sword enthusiast martial arts community. So I figured I'd address it, and I'm afraid I'm probably going to piss some people off, but no, that is not my intention. I'm hoping to start a dialogue, open a conversation, something constructive. Let's build some bridges and then see where those bridges can take us, shall we? And the topic is, well, you've seen it in the title of the video, but basically, does this still deserve its reputation as the bestest sword ever? Now, I mean, a few years ago, I would have given you probably a different opinion than now. But I'm going to break this down into two separate videos. In one video, I'm not going to go back to historic context. I'm going to look at modern times, modern arts practice, and consider my, well, going on half century of experience having one of these in my hand. You learn some stuff. And how does that measure up to other styles that I've studied and other styles that I am now studying? I think I have a sense, after all this time, what this is really good at, good for. And I'm, constantly getting a sense of what maybe it's not so good at, good for. However, as a good martial artist, martial scientist, at least in my mind, my rule has always been study as many arts as possible, learn, practice, dialogue, take the useful parts, at least the useful parts for me, combine them then into my own practice. So when you see me practicing Japanese swordsmanship, it's not going to look very traditional. It's going to have influences from a lot of other arts and a little bit of my own flavor. So be ready for that if the sun ever eventually does shine and I get outside again. So there will be that. So I want to talk about that. And as a good martial artist, martial scientist, strategist, tactician, I mean, you really need to face, honestly, where your strengths are and where your vulnerabilities lie. And then hopefully do something about those vulnerabilities to improve this or whatever other path direction you're going to take, your art, your practice. So that's what we're going to talk about in part 2. Part 1, though, I want to start today by talking about, okay, so how did this thing get the reputation? I'm going to break it down into what I consider the two primary factors, having, again, probably not slept enough. But in, again, my sleep-deprived brain, I'm thinking two things that work together rather synergistically. Synergistically? Yeah, okay. I'm not very good at English. The first of them I'm going to describe as continuity of the practice. And the second one, well, it's going to be fairly an obvious choice, the media and its influence, and those two things working together. What do I mean by the continuity of the practice? Well, I've talked about this in other videos. When I got into martial arts, over 45 years ago, what was available to me back then? Well, the most common thing, Japanese martial arts, which included swordsmanship and weaponry. The next most common were some Korean arts, but they didn't practice a lot of weapons, at least in my area. And what I saw them practicing looked a lot like what I was already studying between Japanese. And then the third thing that got my attention and I got heavily involved in was Chinese martial arts. And if you know anything about Chinese weaponry, you know that they've got a huge amount of and variety of weapons. So for a weapons enthusiast, that was a whole new frontier of paradise. And like I said, I've combined what I do and what I've learned and borrow a little bit of everything and kind of, you'll see it cross over, the lines blur. But in other videos, as I've started to review European swords, I talked about how I would have studied HEMA if HEMA was a thing, but it wasn't. What did I have available? Well, you could go down to the university and get into foil fencing, and most HEMA practitioners will tell you that foil fencing isn't swordsmanship. kind of the laser tag of swordsmanship. Just like I studied kendo. And yeah, I don't consider kendo swordsmanship. But I'm not disrespecting those guys. Let's get that straight. I'm not disrespecting foil fencers or kendo practitioners. I've tried it. Like I said, I've tried those things. I know how hard they are and what it takes to excel at those sports. So yeah, extreme level of skill and dedication and talent. But those things were not for me. Similar in Chinese weaponry. One of the popular expressions of Chinese weaponry is performance wushu. And for me, performance wushu, it's like rhythmic gymnastics with some fight choreography rolled in there. It doesn't really have much to do with actual personal combat, practical application. But I'm not disrespecting those guys. Just like I appreciate gymnastics and dance, the skill, the talent, the beauty, but it's just not my thing. My thing is going to be efficient, effective, stripped down, easy to do with my busted old body. It's going to be that sort of stuff. So yeah, choices. Now, Japanese swordsmanship, though, one of the reasons why I started in it is, it was available, and there's also reasons it's appealing. I'll talk about appeal in a second. But it had been available, like always available in one form or another. There was no interruption really in the art. It had changed, evolved. There were a couple of brief hiccups in history where, it was kind of suppressed. But in one variation or another, there's always been a practice of Japanese swordsmanship, multiple schools usually, and styles and techniques and disciplines from sport to spiritual. And somewhere in between you might get, more of the practical or historic stuff. Now, does it look like what the samurai were actually doing in, when their primary focus was war? And then after that, personal defense? Kind of yes, kind of no. We'll talk about that in the next video. But it was there. So, yeah, HEMA was not. HEMA came in somewhere while I was busy doing other things in other cultures. And back in the day, what I was exposed to, what was available to me, was like the very early stages of it in SCA, Society for Creative Anachronism, practicing in the park, trying to revive these, what were dead arts. But the fact is, these people did that, and they did it really well. These enthusiasts and scholars took those old treatises and manuscripts and studied and then tried to apply and revive and do what was in those books. And then they trained, and then, best thing ever, they pressure tested. And pressure tested and pressure tested and pressure tested. They put this stuff into action. And not just style against same style, which can cause stagnation and vulnerability. They pressure test and practice against every conceivable combination they can come up with. Constantly pushing what works, what's effective in, for them, a sword fight, a real sword fight. Got to respect those guys and really appreciate what they're doing. And we'll talk about that in the other video, where maybe some of the things I have studied kind of fell down a little bit on that. And I've tried to make sure that doesn't happen to me. But again, another video, another topic. However, I think that continuity and the demonstration of those skills then, gave it that leg up. Not only to be available to continually teach to people, but also then influenced its presentation in the media. And, all of us sword enthusiasts, I don't really have to go into this in detail, when we talk about genre, like samurai movies, right, and martial arts movies and ninja movies and stuff like that. Yeah, obviously, super popular. And those probably got a lot of us interested in practicing, studying, collecting, right? There's reasons why we're here, yeah? That includes me, absolutely. However, you've also got to consider how popular it was, causing genre crossover. So think about this for a second. Where did, things like this show up in non-martial arts samurai kind of media? Well, a lot of places. Comic books, You also had Star Wars. Yes, I am old enough to have stood in line on premiere day for the original trilogy releases. And in Phoenix, you're talking not multiplexes, but one single theater in the middle of town that showed that movie for like a year because it was that popular. You stood in line all day to be one of the first people to see those films. And lightsaber combat in those films was clearly influenced by Japanese swordsmanship, and even the philosophies of the Force and the Jedi were, my instructors really grabbed onto that, how similar it was to theories of ki and chi, the philosophy, the metaphysics. I mean, obviously what we were doing in the classroom, we couldn't do the telekinesis parts, but yeah, we were constantly looking at comparisons and very encouraged. And yes, it did bring more enthusiasts and students to the art, because that was the real version of being a Jedi, right? Or a Sith, if you're into that kind of thing. Anyway, what else? This is some places where you didn't expect it to show up. I remember seeing some, period pieces that were set in kind of European settings where they throw in either an Chinese, Japanese swordsman, or at least the weapon out of context, just to prove how cool it was compared to what those clunky, awkward, unskilled Europeans were doing. What's one of the biggest examples of that? Well, I'm thinking of a particular series where a guy who's supposed to be Scottish, though his accent would say otherwise, decides his primary weapon is going to be a katana, right? You know what I'm talking about. I am also old enough to have bought the first Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles comic when it came out. That was also a big boost to the arts. You're talking not only the use of various kinds of samurai or ninja shinobi kind of weapons and martial arts, but there's kobudo thrown in, right? A lot of people didn't know what sais were. They knew what nunchakus were because Bruce Lee made those big a long time ago. But yeah, it's probably the first time anybody else had seen sais. I've been working with them for several years by then. I was amused to see them in a comic as one character's primary choice of weapon. So yeah, media is a huge influence, and that's something. Yeah, it's starting to shift though. Original trilogy Star Wars, definitely Japanese swordsmanship. Prequel trilogy Star Wars, lightsaber combat, definitely HEMA influence. Sequel trilogy, let's not talk about that, okay? I'm not ready. It still hurts. Okay, so what do you think? I think this sword, well, it got a lot more attention than other martial arts swords. It had a lot more schools and a lot more structured practice. Many of them not so much about performance, but trying to stick to traditional function. So that keeping it alive, and then being able to demonstrate some really cool stuff to compete with what was not really in existence, at least for a while. That also includes the swords themselves. I mean, we first got a renaissance, as I talked about in other videos, in reproduction Japanese swords. And people really got into, the art miracle of engineering that some of these were. But as people have started to manufacture good reproduction European swords, yeah, game on. So, to be continued. I hope I didn't offend people too much. This has been my sword for, well, not this one, but my kind of sword for over 45 years now. So I'm not throwing it out the window, but as a good martial scientist, I have to consider what are the strengths, what are the vulnerabilities, where can improvements and evolution be made, if the purpose is using these as they were well intended. All right. Hope to see you back for the second part.